This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics. Reviews of Everblue, Handrava, and Warning Label. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and you're listening to two guys with advanced degrees talking about webcomics.
That's right. And on this episode, Sean and I are going to be discussing 3 webcomics, 2 of which are currently ongoing, and the other that is actually recently completed. We're going to begin with Michael Sexton's Everblue. After that, we're going to discuss Handrava by Rado R. And then we're going to look at the already completed Warning Label by Thom Zahler. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that go higher than that.
And we'd be remiss without mentioning their sister website, mydigitalcomics.com. If you prefer your comics in an electronic format, and who doesn't? That's why we're on this great webcomics podcast after all, right?
Right.
You can find a lot of the great titles there as well, from Boom Studios to Blue Water to Dynamite to Image to a bunch of others. And they have everything available in PDF and or CBZ format, which means they're DRM free, which is a great benefit, as I've told people time and time again. But if you're looking for your comics in a digital format, mydigitalcomics.com is the place to go.
That's right. So My Digital Comics for the digital version, or if you prefer print, dcbservice.com. Go to those places for all of your comics needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Sean and Derek sent you. Well, Sean, we have some interesting webcomics to look at this month, but before we get to those titles, I think we should share some correspondence that we have received since last month's episode.
Mail time. Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
Yeah, it's always great to hear from listeners, and we got an interesting one this week, or this past month, I guess it was, regarding some of the stuff that we talked about last month.
Yes, in particular, You Plus Me, or You and Me, or You Me, as we will discover soon. In fact, we got an email soon after that episode went up from Hector Lera, and I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce his last name, but it's spelled L-L-E-R-A, and he is a photographer and graphic designer. He even gave us his website. He has some really interesting photos there, so you can check them out at ekutoru.com. And he writes, "Hello, Derek and Sean. Thank you for your hard work putting together all the podcasts at the Comics Alternative. I've just listened to your latest webcomics episode at the time I'm sending this." And then he says, "It was informative and entertaining as usual, and I have no idea if you're already aware of what I'm going to write, but I wanted to make this comment about the comic titled You Plus Me, Dreams, because I was waiting for either of you to mention this little fact about the title at some point, particularly since you did speak about the manga influence in the first part of it. Well, the word Yumi, and that's Y-U-M-E, in Japanese actually means dream. Dream as in a dream, because there's no proper verb to dream in Japanese. The expression is to see a dream or to look at a dream, using the verb look or see. But I digress. So the author was playing with words indeed when spelling you as YU. Maybe she mentions it somewhere in the notes, apparently present in the printed version or in the comic itself that I haven't read, but surely will check it out now. It is also used as a first name. We have one Yumi in our family, in fact. That's all. Thanks again for the great podcast. Greetings from Japan. And so we wrote him back. We thanked him, as a listener, and also for giving us a little inside information about how the creator was using Japanese where we didn't really pick up on that. And so he even responded. Oh, I'm sorry. You're going to say?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, and that's fantastic that you can add that layer of complexity and depth to the story that we didn't even know was there. And I'm for one, I'm very appreciative of any information along those lines.
Yes. Then he responded to our thank you email, and he wrote just a quick follow-up because now I've actually read the comic, and to confirm the word is in fact very prominently in it at one point, and he points out a particular page of the webcomic, You Plus Me Dream. He says, but obviously, unless the reader knows Japanese, very hard to pick up the play on words. There's also Sadaku, the ruler in Nod, who is Japanese and uses some Japanese expressions throughout her origin story. Doki Doki in Ano. There's a note/love letter that she writes in Japanese, etc. If you ever interview Geddes, I'd be interested to know where all the Japanese influence and language use comes from. Yeah. Maybe someday we will interview her on the show and we can ask her the questions that Hector expressed.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Hector, thank you very much for this kind of email. As Sean and I say every month, we really do like hearing from you guys. This was a real treat because not only did Hector say, "Hey, I like what you're doing, keep up the good work," but he also educated us.
Yeah, like I was just saying, I really appreciate that kind of stuff. Any of the comics that I read, the more I know about them, I find that the more I enjoy them. It shows to me that the creator is really putting a lot of thought and energy into their work, and sometimes I'm not even aware of it. And so to be able to see that, to be able to at least recognize some aspects of that when I wasn't able to before, I think it gives me certainly a greater appreciation of the work.
Yes. And again, thanks, Hector.
Thank you.
Okay, Sean, let's discuss the 3 titles we're going to look at this month. And we're going to begin with Everblue by Michael Sexton. And listeners can find this webcomic at Everblue. That's one word, everblue-comic.com. That's everblue-comic.com. And this is a webcomic that, we're still at the early stages of the story, but it began way back in January of 2010, but it's currently ongoing. And so there are times as you're reading Everblue where you can see that the author comes out with material on a regular basis, and then there are hiatuses, sometimes for more than a year or two. And then there's another period where there will be, pretty regular or semi-regular storytelling. And then there's another break. But the last installment that we've received on Everblue was January 18th of this year.
Yeah, and I have to, he ends it at a kind of curious place, and I think that's probably has to do, he's got a note on, along with that update about having looked like there were some housing issues he was running into. So I suspect this was not a planned hiatus, but just one of those where life kind of gets in the way of things. But hopefully he'll get that sorted out soon if he hasn't already and can get back to the story. I don't see him dropping it at this point. He's got plenty of material already, and I think I read somewhere in there that this is something he's been thinking about since like middle school. So it is clearly a project he very much cares about. I don't think it'll be going away anytime soon. It's just how soon will he be back up and running?
Exactly. And from the archives or the preliminary archives on this website, it appears that Sexton plans for this to be a 4-volume series, each one corresponding to a particular season. We've started with summer, but there will be volume 2 is going to be fall, and then after that winter, and then spring. But we're still in volume 1, and right now we're in chapter 4 of volume 1, and we don't have any way of knowing, I don't think, how many chapters each volume will have. So that's one of the reasons why I said it seems like we're in the very early stages of this story, even though the webcomic's been around for just a tad over 8 years.
You know what? Actually, I did find a reference. He does make reference somewhere buried in, I don't know, one of the FAQs or the About page or something. That not only will we have 4 volumes, but he says there'll probably be about 8 chapters per volume, too.
Okay, so 8 chapters per volume.
Yeah.
So we're not even halfway through the first volume.
Right. Yeah. So far, we've got, we're in the middle of chapter 4, and there are also, I think, 3 vignettes, I guess is what he's calling them, little shorter side stories that still tie into the main story, but not quite as integral to the overall plot, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so how would you describe Everblue?
Everblue is basically about two characters, or primarily 2 characters, one named Ten and one named Luna. Ten comes to Luna's town kind of by accident. We first see him. He is launching, apparently for the first time, a flying boat. He's sailing through the waters and is able to kick off one of the waves and just start shooting into the air. He doesn't land very well later, and the boat ends up being a problem.
Well, he's shot down.
Well, I was trying to save some suspense there, but yeah. So he's shot down, and Luna is there to kind of help him rebuild things. And once they are able to rebuild a new version of the boat, the old one's pretty well destroyed. They are basically off on adventures together, and we're just kind of at the stage where they've just taken off and gotten to their first destination.
Right, and I guess a town or an island town called Flora, the city that blooms above the waves. And in fact, the world that Everblue takes place in is kind of a fantasy or a fantastical kind of setting. It's a realm that doesn't correspond with our own conceptions of Earth. And it's a world where there's also magic, and we see that at various times throughout the story, especially once we get into chapter 4. And I want to come back to chapter 4 in a little bit to talk about how the narrative takes a more solid turn once we get into chapter 4, because we have the first 3 chapters of that first volume. Then there was those 3 vignettes. And then we get into chapter 4. In chapter 4, I think that Sexton began putting up pages in chapter 4 around 2015. And so as a storyteller, Sexton was developing, I think, learning the rhythm of telling a story via this medium, webcomics, and I think got some traction. He's also doing some interesting things, and I think in chapter 4 is where we begin learning more about this world that Luna and Ten are a part of, which is a world where kind of strange things happen. Well, we would consider strange things happen. Magical things or fantastical elements are involved. But, you know, you mentioned early on that you didn't want to give away that, you know, Ten's flying boat was shot down. I don't think that's a spoiler, because we learned that within the first 2 or 3 pages at the very beginning. But interestingly enough, he is shot down by a character named Seta, and Luna calls Seta her brother, although as we learn later, they're not really brother and sister, at least biologically, but I believe it's in chapter 4, we get a little backstory behind their relationship and why they're so close. And it's important to understand why Luna and Seta are so close, because as we see what happens in chapter 3, that becomes a key relationship.
Yeah. And I think that's because that's the first 3 chapters. I mean, it is an introduction, and we know, and Sexton knows about how long this is going to be overall. So the first 3 chapters are really just an introduction. Who is 10? Who is Luna? We start to get a little bit of Seta's involvement, and there's a general we see briefly, and
Char.
Yeah. But most of it is kind of the setting up the nature of the relationship between Tet and Luna. And then so once we get into chapter 3 is when they first leave the city, tail end of chapter 3, they first leave the city on their adventure. And then in chapter 4, we start getting that more of a sense of story. We've gotten, the first 3 chapters are a solid introduction to the characters, why they're together, why they work together as well as they do, and why they decided to leave the city.
Right. Yeah. And really, there almost seems to be more going on in chapter 4 than there is in the first 3 chapters. Even though, as you point out, the first 3 chapters are important because it basically lays down a narrative foundation that helps us to understand what happens later, especially why Luna is the way that she is. And, in many ways, it's kind of a classic story of a character, a protagonist, who is limited to a very parochial world, but longs for something else, even though they may not know exactly what that something else is. Is it for the outside world? Is it for travel? And I think that's what Luna's situation is. And so when she actually does get away with 10, we start to see her, I think, more of her character and why that previous life that she had was so important to understand, as set up in the first 3 chapters. Mm-hmm. So, I do think that, as I mentioned earlier, that Sexton does develop as a storyteller, because I have to tell you, I enjoyed those first 3 chapters, but there were times that when I was reading the narrative, I felt at moments a little lost. In other words, I had the experience that something was happening or a relationship was developing that I really couldn't grasp, and I didn't know if it was my inability at interpretation or perhaps maybe not enough information is being revealed. Now, I'm not asking for overt exposition, right, where Sexton, through various characters or flashbacks or what have you, tells us the various things that are going on with these characters and how we should read them, what their backstory is, and all of that. But I don't know. I just feel that as Sexton early on, beginning in 2010, was setting up this story world, he was in essence feeling himself around, so to speak, or feeling out his narrative territory, which is fine, because that's one of the things you and I have discussed quite a number of times on the Webcomics series is, one of the things that differentiates webcomics as a platform from print publication is that, in quote unquote real time, you do get to see a creator develop an idea, warts and all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's not only the development of the idea, but just the development of his talent. Mm-hmm. Like you said, I think there's a better sense of storytelling by the time you get from to chapter 4. There's also a better illustration quality. Not only does part of it is just that he starts adding color later on. The most of chapter 1 is in black and white, but the actual illustration itself gets better as he goes along, and noticeably better. Not that it's bad to start with, but it's not as he gets more nuanced and is able to put more expressive pictures on the page and lay them out in such a way that it tells the story better. And I think that kind of speaks to where you were having maybe a little hesitation or a little confusion on some of the early parts of the story, is he was still just trying to figure out his storytelling chops and his illustration chops. And maybe there were some elements that he intended to convey more visibly than through the text, because he's actually I give him a lot of credit for this. He's very reserved with his dialogue and his text. He tries to show a lot of the story through the visuals themselves, where we have, there are several sequences of whole pages with no dialogue at all.
Which a whole series of pages.
Yeah, as like whole
large
sequences.
Chunks of text. Yeah,
large pieces of it, and I think because he gets better as an artist, as a storyteller, that becomes more effective as you get further into the story. So I think that going back to that point about you having a little confusion early on, I think he was trying to do some things with the storytelling that he just didn't have the talent for yet, or to convey with enough nuance to get away with it without having to rely on, some exposition or some extra dialogue or whatever. But there are a few minor little problems like that. I don't think anything that really stops the story or anything, but there's a few cases where you can tell, he's trying to do, at least I thought that he was trying to do something that just didn't quite come off quite successfully enough in those early chapters. But by those later, certainly by chapter 4, a lot of that type of stuff is like, oh yeah, he could totally do this.
Exactly. And I'm glad that you mentioned those segments of the story where we have long stretches of story through art where there's no dialogue whatsoever. I really appreciated those parts. And there are like about, 2, arguably 3 sections in the story so far where we get these long stretches of just silent action. And I was impressed at the way that Sexton was able to carry on the story without words whatsoever. And they were also, I think, affecting moments because there were times, from what I remember, there were 2 particular scenes where Luna and Ten are getting to know one another, and their time together and the things that they do with one another is more important than the conversations that they're having. And so we do get to see on those occasions, the 2 characters coming together in a completely wordless environment.
Yeah. And I think it's, there were several things about this story actually, and that's one of them. But there were several things about the story overall that reminded me of the films of Miyazaki. And some of that is, Miyazaki would put in these, just kind of quiet moments, I guess, for lack of a better term, is, that either the characters were just sitting there enjoying the sunset as it's going over the breeze, or enjoying their flying machine and just watching the clouds whiz past or what have you. There's notable sequences where he just says, okay, I'm just going to let the visuals tell the story. And I think I get the sense that's where that comes from. And between that and the fact that we've got a flying boat here. I mean, Miyazaki is obviously very well known for his flying contraptions and whatnot. And the kind of the anime and manga style of illustration that Sexton uses. I think I would be surprised if he didn't have a Miyazaki influence here.
Oh, I mean, that makes perfect sense when you mentioned Miyazaki for all the reasons that you mentioned. But also you pointed out something that I was going to mention, and that is the manga/anime influence that we see in Everblue. And one of the things, and we've even discussed this on past episodes, with a lot of younger creators, in other words, people who really came to comics over the past, let's say, 15, even 20 years. They were influenced by manga because, as they were growing up, many of the bookstores that they went to, and I'm not necessarily talking about comic shops, but bookstores, when we had more of them than we do now, right? Brick and mortars, they had in their comics or graphic novel sections, these long sections of manga, and many still do. And so I know a lot of people's style was influenced by this. I know whenever my daughter draws, and she does very good work, I know from an early age that much of her art had an overt manga look to it. I mean, I could tell that she was influenced by the styles of the comics that she was reading. And what was she reading? Not Archie, not other things that I would get her, but manga.
Yeah, and that goes to a broader discussion about, just the availability in the comic market and whatever. And because there was a decent period of time where you could not get, Batman or Superman unless you walked into a dedicated comic book shop. Right. You couldn't find Spider-Man or the X-Men unless you walked into a dedicated comic book shop. You couldn't find Archie unless you walked into a dedicated comic book shop.
Or a grocery store.
Or a few grocery stores, shoes, yeah. But even them, those were kind of hidden away and as kind of an aside almost, I think, for a lot of places. But you could go if, you were in a Barnes & Noble or you were in, something of that caliber. When there used to be more bookstores of that caliber, they would have huge manga sections, and there was just there was a lot of availability that what a lot of people don't think of in terms of, I think there's a lot of people that have that discussion on the quote unquote comic industry, and they think of what you get in the direct market, which is very much not the manga industry, or that does not include manga by and large. You actually have trouble getting manga in comic shops in a lot of places. But they're in bookstores. And so, yeah, a lot of kids got onto that. They were reading One Piece. They were reading Bleach. They were reading, all of the other long running titles there. And they were getting
Bleach and One Piece are still going on.
And
those are still going
on, right? 20 years later here at this point, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's bound to be. I am not at all surprised that we see this kind of influence in a way that we didn't see, when you and I were, growing up, and when we would have started doing our own comics, all we had were the superheroes. We pretty much were limited to Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, and doing riffs on that because that was all that was available to us at the time.
Oh, exactly. We see this even outside of webcomics. I mean, the most striking example of that is Brian Lee O'Malley.
Sure.
Scott Pilgrim is nothing if not manga influenced or anime influenced, either one. But another thing I wanted to mention about Everblue is the fact that Sexton, he definitely, we mentioned already that he seems to have a plan in terms of the volume and then chapter layouts, but he also has a plan in other ways. And you can see this if you go to the cast page on his website, on the Webcomics website. Most of the characters there, the main ones, and then what he calls supporting cast, we've encountered before, but unless I'm forgetting something, one of the main characters, and she's listed as a main character, Dagger, we haven't seen her yet, have we?
If we have, it's only been in shadows and one of those I'm not revealing what this character actually is kind of thing. Yeah. But to your point, the other one of the other main characters listed, Gunn, we've only seen very briefly. And right. I think his line, he had maybe one or two lines of dialogue or something. There's definitely there. If the cast page is to believe, these two characters we've seen very little to none of yet will play significant roles in upcoming chapters.
Yeah. Now, what you mentioned about, if we've seen Dagger, we don't know that it's Dagger. I know what you're referring to. I don't know. I have no way of knowing if this one figure we see, and we've seen this figure before the latest chapter of the first volume, chapter 4, but we do get to see this chapter, this figure, this kind of shadowy figure becomes quite prominent toward the end of at least where we are right now, chapter 4. And, if there's a connection to Dagger, there's no way of knowing yet. From the description, right. I'm not completely convinced, but who knows? But what that tells me, nonetheless, whether we have or haven't, inadvertently or otherwise, seen this character Dagger, that there's a lot going on in the head of Michael Sexton that hasn't been played out yet. And so as this story, and again, we're only in the first volume of what's projected to be a 4-volume series. So, this cast page could be quite significantly more populated as we get into volumes 2 and 3.
Yeah, there's clearly there's a lot of story building that he's done in his head, world building that he's done in his head, and because of that and the way the story reads, I like that the problem that I run into with that from time to time with other creators is that they have all this world building that they've been doing for, a decade or whatever. And they've got all this stuff planned out and they feel the need to put every element of that on the page because they thought of it. And so they've got to put it in there somewhere. But Sexton does not do that. He's very judicious with, okay, yeah, he's clearly figured out this whole world system. He's figured out how this city works and how this government works and what the technology is and how these people interact and, what the market economy is and all that. But he doesn't belabor that point in the story. That's stuff that's kind of in his head in the background, or at least seems to be in his head in the background. And it informs the story, but it doesn't, he doesn't make it explicit, and he doesn't have to go into a lot of detail. And okay, these are the types of coins they use in this realm, and a night at the tavern would cost this much. And he's probably got all that figured out, but he doesn't belabor all of that in the story itself, which I think is a sign of a fairly mature storyteller.
Right. Another thing I appreciate about Everblue is the fact that Luna and 10 seem to be kind of balanced. And what I mean by that is, 10 is, I think, the overt adventurer, right? I mean, he is a character that we first see in a flying ship. He arrives at the island city where Luna lives. He's the one who convinces, kind of reluctant Luna to leave the world that she knows in order to explore. And so, one could look at that arrangement and say, okay, well, the male is the adventurer. Luna's a little more passive, but that's really not the case, because it's important to note that Luna is the shipwright who actually develops the boat and discovers the technology, which we haven't even mentioned yet. It's kind of strange. It's not completely explained yet, that takes them into other realms, to where they can fly above the clouds. So, I mean, she makes it possible for 10 to do what he does and what primarily defines him as a character, at least so far.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I thought of that too. I did notice that, and superficially, you kind of get the sense that she's playing the typical kind of reserved female character or whatever. But I think we've seen enough at this point in chapter 4 that's, to your point, he's not strictly following those stereotypes. I think she certainly has her comfort levels of adventure, but in different ways, and her levels of interest and excitement are different than 10's. And 10's has a little bit more kind of I don't want to say stereotypical, but he's kind of has that typical adventure sense, right? Where, oh, hey, I need to get water for my cool map, so I'm just going to jump off the side of the ship and not tell anybody, and she goes into a panic. There's the kind of a devil may care attitude kind of thing. But as we start getting into the story more, particularly in chapter 4, he starts breaking down those stereotypes a little bit, I think, and showing that, while Luna does not have that same sense of its typical sense of adventure, and devil may care attitude, she's certainly not reserved in a kind of stereotypically female projection either. She's right. just her balances are a little bit set differently than 10's, and that's all they are. They have their preferences and they have their comfort zones, and those are not necessarily strictly stereotypical, even though they might seem that and at first blush.
Mm-hmm. Sean, you want to move on to the second title that we're going to be looking at this month?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is Handrava, and I guess I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm not entirely certain. This is a webcomic created by Rado R. At least that's the name that the creator goes by. R-A-D-O-R period. And as for where our listeners can find this webcomic, actually there are a couple of places, and we should definitely go into more detail about this. But probably the most advantageous place for you to read Handrava is at the Tapas site. And we've talked about Tapas webcomics in the past, and that's tapas.io. And so if you go to Tapas and do a search for Handrava, Handrava, then you'll find it. Or just go to tapas.io/series/Handrava, and you'll find it there. But you can also find Handrava at Tabulit, and that's Tabulit. Their website is TABULITCOMICS.com, so tabulitcomics.com, and you'll find Handrava there. However, unless you subscribe to Tabulit, then you won't be able to read any of Handrava. And in fact, when
on Tabulit,
on Tabulit, right?
Yeah.
But if you go to Tapas, you can, and we can talk about this curiosity. When I first discovered Handrava, I did so through a reference to tabulitcomics.com. And I remember I got in touch with you and I said, "Oh, this looks really interesting. It takes place in Madagascar. It has a unique art style. Why don't we look at this?" And I gave you the link to the Tabulit site. And then later on, when I went to read and prepare for the show, I discovered, what the hell? I can't read it unless I subscribe. And you can get, I think, a preliminary free subscription for, 30 days, something like that.
Right.
But I didn't want to do that. But you got in touch with me and let me know that you can also find this on Tapas.
Yeah. And let's table that for a little bit though, and talk about the story first.
Good point. So this is a webcomic. Actually, it's relatively young. It started in February of last year, and the last part of Handrava actually was February of this year. So there are, I guess, 12 chapters so far, or I guess you can call them chapters, to this first arc. And then we have, I think it's 3 pages of guest art. The most recent of which was about a week ago as we record this.
Yeah.
So in essence, what we have is about a chapter a month, roughly speaking. I mean, there's some months where we see a couple of chapters, and at times there may be a stretch like between 7 and 8 where there's a month's difference between them. But, for all practical purposes, this has been out about a year. We have 12 chapters. And this is a story that is definitely not as fantastical as Everblue.
No. Definitely a more of a slice of life type of thing. As I think you mentioned already, that this takes place in Madagascar, and it's basically following a young woman whose name is, I think it's pronounced Voenio, or Voenio. I'm terrible with names.
No, that's good. It's Voanio.
Yeah. So it's basically follows her and some of her friends living in Madagascar, the capital. And they just, they're regular types of people. They work in the market by day. Voenio is particularly strong, so she goes around by night pulling a cart to pick up garbage and haul materials around. And she partially does that by night, but because there's apparently some laws about whether or not you can carry a cart around through the streets during the day. And it's basically them just kind of hanging out and getting on with their lives and trying to make something of themselves. And they're going around doing chores and helping people out, and then they stop by and have some beers, meet up with a few friends, and then I think probably the biggest action point that we've got so far is then on their way home they end up in an attempted mugging, and then we start seeing some more interesting. It's not, I wouldn't say fantastical, but certainly more less mundane elements coming to fore there.
Right, yeah, and that's where the action really takes place. And in fact, this attack where Vanyo and her cousin Papango, and I guess that's how you pronounce her name, they've been out with a couple of friends that they meet on the way home one night. And then toward, I guess, the tail end of chapter 10 of this first arc, which is titled Welcome to Tanya, or Tana, is when they're attacked. And then that carries us into definitely chapter 11 and then 12. And, as you mentioned, there, at least for me as a reader, when I first read this, there were inklings that Vanyo is kind of a well-built, strong character because she is pulling this cart, but her strength and her abilities really hit home in the last couple of chapters during this attack, and especially in chapter 12, of what she's able to do in terms of confronting the street attackers, these muggers that get them, but. We'll leave that to readers to find out exactly what it is that she's able to do. Another thing about that confrontation at the end of this first narrative arc is it does tell us something more about Papango, the cousin, because when we first see her in Vanyo, it seems like Vanyo is the responsible one, the one who, obeys the laws, the one who, doesn't drink in the morning. Whereas her cousin is someone, Papango, who has no qualms about drinking in the morning. In fact, when this, narrative opens, that's what she's doing. She also seems to, do less work, to hang out, to play games, to watch videos or animation at like an internet type cafe. But we also see what I assume will be defining features of her character that come out during this street confrontation, toward the end of this first arc.
Yeah, there's definitely an interesting dynamic going on between the two. Because even though Papango, comes across initially as, is just almost like a drifter type of character and just, hey, I'm just here out having fun. I don't want any responsibility, juvenile almost in her approach. There's still enough there peppered throughout the story, but particularly during the last couple of chapters, that shows she's actually got a great deal of responsibility, and understands that, but she doesn't let that weigh her down, apparently.
Right.
There's some allusions like, early on, as Vanyo is going off on some errand, she just turns to Papango and says, "Hey, open the shop for me." And, just walks off and he's like, "Okay, I know Papango is going to take care of it. And I just told Uncle that she's opening the shop now, and we all know that it's all good, and nobody's panicking about, oh my God, it's Papango running things or anything like that." So it's clear that she does have some level of responsibility early on, and she's not just a complete write-off character or write-off friend or what have you. She does have some less than desirable qualities, I guess you might say, but she's still
but she doesn't smoke.
But she's very clear. She does not smoke. She doesn't seem to shirk her duties. Even though she has to be coerced into them sometimes. And I also get the sense too, they don't really go into a lot of detail here, but I got the sense that part of the delivery service that the two of them have is largely run from a business perspective by Papango. and
Right.
she's setting up the deals and who's going to get helped out and how much they're going to get paid and what the contract is and all that. And Voenio is mostly around as the muscle.
Exactly. And another thing about that business relationship is Papango, you're right, it's the one who does set up things and who does, so to speak, keeps everything going. Voenio may be the muscle, but another thing that she brings to the business is more compassion, less of a business sense. And so that kind of gets in the way, or can potentially get in the way of business, because at one point in this first arc, we get Voenio and Papango on the phone, and Voenio is telling her cousin that she stopped to help someone. And, that's a good thing. On the other hand, Papango points out that's going to make you late for the delivery, and we can't let the customer down.
Yeah.
So we get a sense that Voenio has this. I mean, this is one of her characteristics, right? She is helpful to a fault.
Yeah. And also, and also very law abiding too. There's a very clear sense that, that there's a discussion early on where they talk about, hey, couldn't you make more money doing your cart thing during the day? Because, other people are doing it and the cops aren't pulling them aside and they're not getting fined or anything. And she expressly says, no, I can't do that. That's against the law. Even though, and she goes even further and says, even though that's wrong, even though that law is wrong, it's still the law and I will still obey it until it changes, until we can do something to change that. And actually, you know what? She doesn't say, that's the point, is she doesn't say until we can change it. And she says until it changes. She's kind of removed herself from being an actionable character, almost deliberately. She's stepping herself out and saying somebody else is going to take care of that. I'm just doing what the law says.
Right. So yeah, I like this story. We don't have much of it. Again, it's relatively young. It's only been around a year. We have 12 chapters so far, but I like it. I like the art style. Let's talk a bit about the style. How would you describe what Rado R does?
You know what? I've been trying to figure out what a good way to describe it would be. It's a little on the cartoony side, and also has a rough quality to it. Like the pencil or the marks on the page, the ink lines, have a literal roughness to them. They're not very smooth at all. And it adds, I think it adds a little bit of a charm to it. But despite the line work being rough, it's still, I wouldn't say detailed, but it's not like it's just scribbles either. I kind of liken it maybe to, the closest analogy I can think of is, kind of the inking style of, Carlos Izquierda, who used to do the Judge Dredd, strips way back in the 70s and 80s. He was, it's not quite the same, but his inking style had this kind of roughness to it, and kind of a coarse edge to it. So a lot of the pieces, even though we're in this gleaming city, there was a kind of a dirtier, grittier edge to the line work, nonetheless. Something between that and late stage Charles Schultz, who, again, had a very clean pen line, but his, as he got older, his hand got a little shakier, and you could see that in some of the late period Charles Schultz art as well. So something kind of a cross between the two of those. It's not quite an exact match, but that's the closest I can think of.
What it reminds me of is the kind of comics that you're probably more apt to find in, let's say, anthology publications by publishers such as Fantagraphics, let's say, or the kind of art that you would encounter from smaller, if you want to call them alternative presses like Retrofit, Big Planet, Koyama, publishers like that. Now, you mentioned that there's kind of a cartoony style, and I think to some degree, yeah, I would agree. Although one way that I would not describe Rado R's art, it's very different from, I would say, most of the webcomics that we discuss on this series. I don't want to, in what I'm about to say, I do not want to suggest that there's something wrong with this kind of style or that this is a prevalent style in all webcomics. But when we were talking about Michael Sexton's work with Everblue earlier, that is the kind of art that I think you're more apt to find in webcomics than otherwise. But with Rado R, it's cartoony to a point, but it's also quite realistic. In other words, we don't have the wide eyes, we don't have the exaggerated movements or physical features. And so it does have a more realistic edge to it. And because Rado R is dealing with real life or realistic issues, I think that's something else, along with a style that makes me think that this story is something like you would find published through Fantagraphics or Drawn in Quarterly, let's say.
Yeah.
There's something about that style that really drew me, no pun intended, to want to investigate what Handrava was all about.
Yeah, it's definitely I hesitate to say unique, but it is unique to me, I think. I don't see this very often. And I suspect, and I couldn't find very much information on Rado himself, but I suspect he is from Madagascar. And, I would assume that's why the story is located there. Which would suggest a larger European influence in the story. Whereas, obviously in the United States and Great Britain, we have a slightly different style historically. Japan has a very different style, and as we discussed earlier, that kind of seeps over into the States on occasion. But I think European comics, while they certainly have their own style, especially with the Ligne Claire, kind of Hergé motif, that's certainly there, but you don't see that here, but it still has that kind of, it has some more European sensibilities to this, I think, than we typically see in a webcomic.
Oh, definitely. I agree with you 100% there. And, like you, I suspect that Rado R is Madagascan. Is that the adjectival form of someone who lives in Madagascar?
I think so. Yes, I'm going to run with that.
Yeah. And for no other reason, because he seems to. From what I can gather, I just suspect this because what do I know about Madagascar language, character, culture? But he seems to capture the flavor of the way that people speak there. In other words, there are particular ways that the characters communicate with one another in ways that definitely stands out to native English speakers. So, for instance, when they address one another, they say either it's the E with a caret on top or an O with a character on top. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but after I got into the story, I just assumed that these are the verbal markers of this particular region, this particular territory of Madagascar. So, I'm just assuming that what he's attempting to do here is to represent the way that the characters do communicate or speak with one another. Another thing about Rado R style that I want to mention is I really appreciate his use of negative space. Yeah. Now, let me preface that by saying that this is a comic, again, that we're reading on Tapas, and I'm assuming it's the same way on Tablet. With Tapas, as with Webtoons, which is going to be the next webcomic that we discuss, the Thom Zahler's Warning Label, one of the things that distinguishes those platforms from, let's say, what we find in Everblue, and I think most other webcomics, is that their format is that you have several pages that are presented vertically, and you have to scroll down in order to read a particular chapter or installment of that webcomic. And that's the nature of Tapas as well as Webtoons. And what Rado R does is there are times when you're scrolling down a particular chapter and there is a gap or just blank or white space between panels, and he uses that for effect, sometimes as a scene shift, but at other times perhaps to set a mood. And to have something kind of stand out on its own. And I really do appreciate the way that he does that. And along with that, and I'm looking in particular at the 8th chapter of this first arc, Welcome to Tana.
Yeah.
Because, we see both, Vanyo and Papango together at the very beginning of this first arc. Then they part and each is doing her own thing. But then in chapter 8, we see that the two characters are coming back together, physically coming back together to the same location. And the way that Rado R handles this visually is that we have these long vertical panels, one on each side of the page at the top of chapter 8. And one is of Vanyo and what she's doing, and the other side is Papango, and they're coming from different locations, physical locations. And as they get closer and closer to one another, the panels that represent what each of them are doing comes closer together. And so there's kind of a meeting of the panels, which results in a literal meeting of these characters when they hook up again. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was clever.
Yeah, he does a very good job of taking advantage of that kind of scrolling effect. Mm-hmm. I had the only thing that I have not seen yet that would be interesting to see how he approached it would be kind of one of those absurdly long panels that acts as multiple panels because you have to scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll. The kind of thing that Scott McCloud talked about when he was talking to Infinite Canvas and all that. But very few people actually use. But I think were the situation where the story warranted, I think that would fit in very well here. And even though that's not used, Rado uses a lot of that type of sensibility. Knowing that he's in a webcomic, knowing that that's going to be read differently than if it was a printed comic.
Right. Although, since he's on the platform Tapas, maybe that platform wouldn't allow him as much freedom in terms of scrolling both diagonally and horizontally for long periods of time.
That's possible, yeah. That's possible, yeah. We've not looked into exactly how their operations work in that sense, but if that warranted, like I said, I don't think the story warrants it so far, at least. But I could certainly see him taking advantage of something like that.
Okay, well, before we leave this webcomic, let's get back to something we referenced at the top of our discussion of Handrava, and that is the fact that it's on two different platforms, one of which you have to pay to read, the other is free. I mean, what do you make of that? I've never seen anything like this before. Yeah,
I was really struck by this, honestly. Like you said, if you go to the Tabulate Comics website, you get the kind of introduction page that says, here's what the story's about. There's, a little bit of sample art, very, very little, not enough to tell what the story is. And then says, hey, subscribe and support. And you actually do see, here there's 12 chapters available. Click on one to read the next chapter. I could see an argument being made, and as many people have done this, where, okay, I want to make sure that somebody is able to read some of it, so that, they might be willing to part with money to go read it in full. I mean, that's, if you put the entire thing behind this paywall, well, who's going to read it, right? That's without being able to at least see some idea, right? A little trial before you buy kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Putting the entire thing out in another platform entirely, I'm not sure. I honestly, I don't know what the purpose of that would be. If it were something other than Tapas, that the site was posted on. And if it was somebody other than Rado, I could say, okay, somebody is basically screen scraping all their stuff and reposting it illegally. But as far as I can tell, Rado is actively posting in both places. And apparently keeping both of them active simultaneously. So honestly, I do not understand the business logic here, if there is any. Maybe he just felt that he signed the only thing I can think of is maybe he signed up with Tabulate originally. They had some kind of contract with them, and then decided that, you know what, I'm not making any money for this anyway. I'm not getting any name recognition. Let me throw it somewhere else so that people can actually read it. That's about the only thing I can think of. It really, honestly, I don't understand the logic behind it otherwise. And I'm sure Rado has his reasons for it, but I can't imagine what those are.
Right. Now, what do you know of Tabulate? If anything, have you read comics on there before? Because they do have some free ones, but much of the stuff that they offer there, you have to pay for through subscription.
Yeah, honestly, I do. I've heard of them, but I've never really I never played around with it, precisely because you have to pay for most of it. And there are plenty of other webcomics out there that I don't have to pay for that I can take out my time with. So honestly, I don't know a whole lot about them, and I'm actually even a little confused. If you go through at least on the Handrava page on Tabulate, the first button that tells you to subscribe says subscribe and support Handrava for $6.99 a month. But then if you keep scrolling down the page, then it says you could subscribe to Tabulate overall for $4.99 a month.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's different than the $6.99 a month. Do you get only Handrava for $6.99 a month, but then you can get everything for $4.99 a month, or does the $4.99 a month only allow you to see some but not Handrava? If you subscribe specifically to Handrava, does he get more money than if you subscribe to the thing overall? Honestly, I don't see. I don't have a sense of what the model is here, and it seems to be confusing even within the context of a single page.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I'm confused when it comes to Tabulate on a couple of levels. I guess more locally, as we're discussing Rado R's Handrava, I don't know what to make of this decision to offer the comic on a free site, but at the same time require people to subscribe to another platform where it's housed in order, and they can only see any of it. I mean, you can't even sample, right?
Right.
It's like if you want to see the first one or two pages just to get a sense, hey, is this something I may want to read through subscription? You can't even see that. I mean, you have to sign up, albeit maybe the first 30 days can be free, but after that, you have to fill out your name, email address, and all of that. And the vast majority of the webcomics out there, you don't need to worry about that. Mm-hmm. The other thing that has me scratching my head is, why would a webcomics platform use this business model, knowing that the world of webcomics is 99% free? Because they don't even give samples. And I was looking at some of the comics that Tabulate houses, and there's one that I definitely recognize. And, this is Hans Ricketts' Cochlea and, Cochlea and Eustacia.
Yeah. Which I believe, doesn't he have that for free on his own site as well? Okay.
Now I don't know if it was with you or if it's right before you came on when Wolverton and I were doing this. This is back in 2015. We looked at Ricketts' Ectopiary as a webcomic in the past. Now, was that with you or with Andy?
I think that was with me, yeah.
Okay, so it was an early one. Mm-hmm. So we looked at that. In preparing for the show, I went back to that episode and followed the Ectopiary link, it's dead. So ectopiary.com is no longer working. And so I don't know if that means that Rickite has chosen to take his site down and to house the comics elsewhere, such as on Tablet. I don't know. I mean, but the bottom line is that, whether it's someone we recognize or not, the fact that you can't even get samples of the art without subscribing seems to be a barrier to entry that I just don't understand for a webcomics platform.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of would be that if there's a couple of things that occur to me that might influence the decision. I don't know for sure. I'm guessing wildly here. But one might be that they're just trying a different model and saying, you know what, hey, the ad model doesn't work, right? Everybody's got ad blockers on their system anymore. That just doesn't work. Kickstarter, Patreon, those might work for some people, but that requires a lot of extra effort and business savvy on the creator's part that you might not have. So let's try some other model that still gets people paid, but the creators don't actually have to worry about the kind of the financing end of it and the business model aspect of it. I can kind of see some argument there, but again, the lack of sampling for all the comics doesn't. I think that's kind of a poor model, personally. The other thing I can think of, this is really kind of a bit of a stretch too, is that if Rado is indeed from Madagascar, as we think, it's possible that he's interested, at least because of local blocking laws and local censorship laws, where they might, as a country, keep people from going to a site like maybe Tapas. So if he might not have the resources to put his comic on a site that is accessible without a firewall, that might make sense for him specifically. But that is really just kind of a shot in the dark guess. I honestly, I'm drawing a lot of blank on this one, frankly.
Okay, well, if any of our listeners has any response or any answer to these questions that Sean and I are kind of mulling over now in terms of, the pay platform of Tablet, or why Handrava is on both a paid site and also a free platform, definitely get in touch and let us know your thoughts.
Please.
Well, let's move on to the final webcomic that we're going to be looking at in March. And this is something that I think both of us, in terms of the creator, are very familiar with, Thom Zahler. And this webcomic, Warning Label, is a webcomic project that he began working on in June of last year. And he just completed it recently, back in February, last month. Now, and I think you as well, Sean, first became familiar with Thom Zahler through his series Love and Capes. But he's had, which, came out on, and I can't remember the original publisher of Love and Capes, Merkel, Maerkle Press. I don't know if that's his own press or not. But then with the second, I guess, manifestation of Love and Capes, IDW picked it up. And so he's primarily been published through IDW since then, because we have Love and Capes. Then we had a few years ago, the miniseries Long Distance that he collected, I think last year or maybe a year and a half ago, as, one complete collection, or graphic novel, if you prefer to call it that. And then most recently, Time and Vine. And Time and Vine started about a year ago, not quite a year ago as well. And so that was a limited series that I don't know if the collection of Time and Vine is out now or it's just about to come out. But this is different. This is Warning Label, a webcomic. that's been going on for, I don't know, about 8 months or so, and just wrapped up, but it definitely has the Thom Zahler feel, right? So if you read Loving Capes and Long Distance and or Time and Vine, without knowing that Warning Label was created by Thom Zahler, you could look at it and say, that's Thom Zahler. And not just because of the art style, but because of the tone and the theme of Warning Label.
Yeah. And that's the one of the reasons why I think he does so well just generally as a creator is even though he's got a story like Love and Capes, which is kind of ostensibly about superheroes, that's not what the story is about, right? You're invested in the characters and their interrelationships, and that's the interesting thing, particularly the characters who have a relationship with one another. And that's what we have here with Warning Label is one of the main characters, Danielle, is hanging out at a bar, and some guy kind of siles up next to her, and they get to chatting because she's got a gaming tattoo that he recognizes. And as soon as he starts to hit on her, she says something to the effect of, "Okay, just so you know, it's about to get weird." And just about that time, a puff of smoke and a bit of flame, and there's a giant Warning Label sitting on his on the bar in front of him. And come to find out that her last ex and her had a really bad breakup, and he basically put a curse on her that said any guy who comes up and hits on you and tries to get a date with you or whatever will have a warning label telling them here's all the problems that she has. Mm-hmm. And, it says she's cares about her job more than relationships. She hates kids. She's, very goal oriented and not concerned about your priorities at all. And
unable to make a commitment. Unable to make a commitment. She erratically changes her mind on things.
Yeah. But Greg here, who's the guy who's hitting on her, is actually intrigued by this, and she's surprised because it usually scares people off. And then they start a relationship, and then so the story then follows how that relationship works over the course of. I think the story takes place over about a year as well, if I remember right.
Now you said Greg. I thought the character's name was Jeff.
Jeff. I'm sorry. Yes, my mistake.
Okay.
But yeah, so it follows the basically their budding relationship, and it goes through ups and downs. And again, that's what Zahler does with his stories. It's got a very interesting twist with this warning label, and but then the story that you're interested in isn't about the magic that happens and the fact that curses can be a thing, which Jeff is continually surprised about and no one else seems to be surprised about. But it's the relationship that they go through, and and that includes the ups and the downs.
Right.
The good
you're
and
right
the bad.
and you're right to point out that throughout Zahler's oeuvre, relationships are front and center. Now, it had an overt genre twist with Loving Capes, obviously. Mm-hmm. But with Warning Label and Time and Vine, again, the relationships are front and center, but the more fantastical elements are also there, but they create a particular, let's say, creative backdrop against which the relationships really play themselves out over. Now, Long Distance is the one narrative that at least I can think of from Zahler where there's not anything other than realism going on in the story. But with Warning Label and with Time and Vine, there's something kind of strange going on, right? So in Warning Label, it's this curse that Danielle has placed upon her, and she is strapped with after her last relationship, after that last breakup. And one of the things that Jeff helps her with is coming to terms with what appears on the warning label, like, that she's emotionally distant, she's self-opinionated, hates children, fear of commitment, so on and so forth. And as he helps her to learn more about herself, those items on the warning label fade away. And so that becomes a goal, or one of the goals of the relationship that they have. So again, that's something kind of fantastical. The fantastical element of Time and Vine that he actually started to come out with, roughly speaking, around the time of warning label. I don't know if you've read any. Did you read any issues of Time and Vine?
No, I can't say that I have. I'm mostly familiar with his Love and Capes.
Right. Well, with Time and Vine, basically what you have is, a winemaker or a wine collector who, when you drink the wine from a particular vintage, you and the person that you're drinking with are taken back to that particular time when it was bottled. And so that is kind of another fantastical twist on how Zahler deals with relationships. It's interesting because, I mentioned that Warning Label and Time and Vine started to come out around the same time. I had the pleasure of talking briefly with Thom at Heroes Con last year, because when I'm at Heroes Con, I like to go around and talk, or any con, I like to go around and talk with creators for, anywhere from 4 to 10 minutes, for, a series of interview shows, where the episodes are like a string of short interviews with a variety of different people at Artist Alley. And Thom was one of those people that I spoke with last year. And I think I had just read about the first issue of Time and Vine. And so I talked with him about that. But it was during my conversation with him at Heroes Con that he told me about Warning Label. And Warning Label had just started in June of that year. And he said, I just started a webcomic. And in fact, if our listeners go back to that episode, that on location episode, they'll hear me talking with Thom and him telling me for the first time about Warning Label. And so I've been wanting to read this for a while, and that's why when I saw that it had wrapped up in February, and I told you, this is the perfect opportunity. Let's discuss Warning Label.
Sure. But yeah, it's I think it's a good thing that you can just pretty much say that this is a Thom Zahler story.
Right.
If any of the listeners are familiar with, Time and Vine or Love and Capes or anything that he's done in the past, this follows that same. It's a different story and it's a different relationship and it has its own unique qualities, but it still has all of the things that I think make a Thom Zahler story a Thom Zahler story. And if you like Love and Capes, if you like Time and Vine, I think a lot of that will come through in this as well. It's a very, there's a lot of his sensibilities. I mean, not just with the relationship itself, but just the people in general. He's got all of these characters that are very clearly identified, and the relationship to one another is all clearly identified. Right. And he's very good about just making it about people. Mm-hmm. And every character seems like a real person. Even some of these minor background characters, they at least come across as having a full backstory and, full characterization, even though we don't actually see any of it,
right. And they're flawed characters as well, because not only does Danielle come with her own baggage, but so does Jeff.
Right. And that's part of the story too, is that, Jeff almost takes it as a challenge that, and just for a sense of fair play, if he gets a warning label about her, she should get a warning label about him. So, on their first date, he scratches out, his own warning label of sorts and, writes off whatever 4 or 5 of his big traits that are really terrible. Because he's just coming off of a marriage that ended very badly, and he largely blames himself for.
Right. And in that way, this story, as well as in a number of other ways, this story is reminiscent of Rob Reiner's When Harry Met Sally. Mm-hmm. And I don't say that I didn't make that comparison. Actually, Zahler makes that comparison right. in a kind of a self-aware way, One of the minor characters, one of Jeff's friends, at one point says to him something about that. Have you ever seen When Harry Met Sally? And that's in essence the kind of relationship that we have here, right? We have two people who meet, where the guy had been in a serious committed relationship before. He meets someone else. They seem to hit it off. They begin dating. Then they realize that there may be problems. They kind of break up, but then they decide to come together as friends. But then over time, the friendship develops into something much more serious. And so they get together at the end. Now, by saying they get together at the end, that's not at least in my book, not a spoiler in any way. By saying that this is very much like When Harry Met Sally, I mean, you know where it's going to go, but it's, I think, the ride that Zahler takes you on in this narrative that is so impressive. Because it's a Thom Zahler story, you know that these two characters are going to end up together. But how do they end up together? Well, just stick around and read on and you'll see. We've talked about the Zahler style in terms of art, but also in terms of theme and his storytelling abilities. Thom Zahler is someone that if you described his comics to me, and I didn't know who he was, I would say it's not the kind of thing that I would enjoy. And not only in terms of comic, but I think in terms of just storytelling in general, because there's something very, and I mean this in a positive way, very quaint, very reassuring and optimistic and uplifting about a Thom Zahler narrative. And my, I guess, story predispositions are much more cynical than that. And so if I hadn't read Thom Zahler and you were to describe to me the kind of stories that he engages in, I would probably be put off and say, I probably wouldn't be for my taste. Thom Zahler is one of those creators that kind of confounds the kind of reading interest that I have. I cannot help but love a Thom Zahler story, even though the elements and the characteristics that make up a Thom Zahler narrative seem to be the kind of storytelling that I just wouldn't enjoy. But I do.
Yeah, and honestly, that's kind of how I came to Thom's work in the first place. Is I first, the first piece I read of his was Love and Capes, and I came to it because it was a superhero story. I wouldn't. I'm same boat. If you'd sit down and try to explain the kind of the main elements of a Thom Zahler story, I probably would say, yeah, okay, he might do a good job of it, but probably not my thing. But because he, at least with Love and Capes, since he wrapped it in that superhero genre, I was like, okay, as a superhero thing, I like superheroes well enough. Let's check this out. And it was only after reading, I was like, oh, it's not really about superheroes. That's just the kind of the window dressing for it. And this is, in many respects, it's the superficial stuff, the window dressing to warning label is honestly, as I'm thinking about it, not that far removed from PvP by Scott Kurtz. Right. And that's in that strip. It's a gag strip, but it's kind of it does have a overarching kind of storyline to it, element to it. And the characters are, work for a gaming magazine. And they're working and around the gaming industry. And the same thing applies here, just instead of video games, it's more board games and puzzle games and that kind of thing. And Jeff here works at a movie theater. So it's, again, kind of spiraling this pop culture reference point, but that's not why you read it. That's not, there's references to, or allusions, I guess I should say, to, movies like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and that kind of thing. And there's allusions to RPGs and other types of games that are out there. But that's not the focus, because the focus is so much on the people and those relationships. That ends up being, again, kind of the window dressing for the meat of the story itself, which, again, not something I would necessarily come to the table for, but it kind of works.
Right.
Zahler just does a really good job with that genre of, or not that genre, but that storytelling style. And he's able to use the genre elements to draw people in who might not normally come in, I think.
Exactly. And, you mentioned that Danielle works in the gaming industry. not only does she work in the industry, but she becomes, a serious big time game designer over the course of this story. And she also is the one of the company that goes to various conventions and stands at a table and sells the game or game components and whatnot, and helps to publicize that to fans, right? Pop culture, comics fans and whatnot. And, this is where I think much more so than his other stories, Loving Capes, Long Distance, and Time and Vine, this is Thom Zahler in many ways writing about a milieu that he's very familiar with.
Yeah.
And so when Danielle is at a con, she is experiencing the kind of things that he does on a regular basis. And so he really did seem in his element in these parts of the story. In fact, when we get to chapter 21, and this is a story on Webtoons that's about, 38, I think, chapters long.
Yeah.
But once we get to chapter 21, and this, I don't know, this really struck me, and I found it very effective. We actually do see Thom Zahler, or a cartoon or a comics figure of Thom Zahler, who's not a part of the story of Warning Label, but at the end, I think from 21 on, and I think maybe every chapter after 21 or 21 and after, toward the end, we get an appearance by Thom Zahler, who sometimes is telling us that he's going to be at a con. So if you're there, I'll be at this table. I hope to see you there. Or he is making some announcement. I think around Thanksgiving of last year, he said, well, it's going to be Thanksgiving next week in the United States. And you see him with a turkey. Okay.
Right.
So he makes an appearance. And what that does is not only does it help him as a creator, right? Because when he says, hey, I'm going to be at New York Comic Con, come to my table, that helps him. But also it personalizes it. And I think it draws in the webcomics reader in a way that is much more intimate, because when you get to the end of those chapters, you're not literally looking at him. You're looking at a figure of him, right? A representation of him, but it's like he's looking at you and you're looking at him and you're communicating with him. And there's something very touching about that. And I just thought that was quite effective.
Well, particularly for the environment too, because again, this is on Webtoons, which means that he has limited options in terms of making promotions. Like if you're like the others, we talked about Everblue earlier, right? If you can click around that site and read about Sexton, and he can post something that says, hey, I'm having housing issues, so there might be a little hiatus, or I'm going to appear at this convention, or he has, because that's an entirely his own platform, he can use that to talk about and promote himself or anything else he wants. Right. Because this is being run through Webtoons, Thom does not have that luxury. Without something like this, basically inserting himself in as part of the story. And I suspect that's why that doesn't show up until like halfway through the story, is he kind of didn't realize right away. It was like, oh, wait a minute, I don't have the same options here. My audience here is maybe not necessarily the same one that I have on lovingcapes.com or wherever. So in order to say, hey, I'm going to be at Tucson, I'm going to be at, Emerald City or wherever, he needs to essentially insert himself into the story in a way that he doesn't need to do on his own site.
Or he inserts himself into the comic, but not the story.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes,
and that's I mean, he doesn't like to do Grant Morrison, right?
Right.
That'd be freaky. Yeah. And by the way, it's 39 chapters, not 38. In Warning Label. So I corrected myself there. But yeah, I enjoyed all three of the webcomics that we're discussing for March. But I have to say that the one that affected me the most, Warning Label. And that's not to, say that, Handrava and Everblue lacked something. I went into this month's readings knowing Thom Zahler and liking Thom Zahler's work. And so I think I was predisposed to really like Warning Label. But then having read Warning Label, that just underscored what I was anticipating.
Well, and it helped too that we had a solid resolution to this story,
Exactly.
the other two are, I think, are early enough on in the storytelling itself that it's, we can get a sense of the characters, but we don't have their whole journey by any stretch. Whereas this one, as the completed comic of the three that we're talking about this month, we clearly get that full arc, we get that full journey of the characters, and kind of like you said earlier, it's a good story that has a nice happy ending, and it's kind of got that optimism that has a nice gives you a warm fuzzy.
Yeah, it does. And, I'm not the warm, fuzzy kind of guy in terms of storytelling, but Thom Zahler brings that appreciation out in me.
Mm-hmm. Same here.
Yeah.
Same here.
Yeah. Another difference between Warning Label and Handrava and Everblue is that with Warning Label, we have a seasoned storyteller, right? So whereas Michael Sexton and I think Rado R, from what we can gather, are younger storytellers, and by what we gather, I mean, we don't know of other things they've done. Thom Zahler's been around the block a few times, and so he knows what it's like to really tell a story. So he's had more time to develop his craft.
Yeah, he's certainly the most experienced veteran storyteller we've got here. And it really shows in the storytelling. I mean, even though he doesn't get wildly creative like Rado does with the layouts or anything. But it's still, in fact, I think all of the panels, if I remember correct, all of the panels throughout the entire pieces are just squares.
Right.
But it's still, because he's been doing this long enough that he knows how to tell a story. It still remains very effective, even though he doesn't play out with the layout at all anywhere.
Right. And even if he did get a little more experimental, that would be a break from, and that'd be great if he wanted to do that, but it would definitely be a break from what we've seen previously, with Loving Capes, Time and Vine, Long Distance. He has his own style, and a part of that style is his panel layout and the pacing. So, mm-hmm. There's that. One other thing I want to point out about Warning Label, I said that, the main characters, Danielle and Jeff, each of them have their own faults. I couldn't help but notice in the reader comments that follow each of the chapters that for a while there were a lot of people who were just really annoyed with Danielle. They were saying, can't she give Jeff a break? God, she's such a bitch. Why is she like this? And, that doesn't tell me really much about readers as it does about Zahler's effectiveness in terms of creating character. Because, I agree. There are parts of Danielle that were really bugging me, but they were supposed to bug me because, again, she's not a perfect person. Jeff has his own problems, just as Danielle does. But, Danielle seems to be the center of this narrative because, after all, she's the one with the major warning label.
Right. Yeah. And I think that goes to Zahler's ability to create people, not just characters, right? We've got very clear sense of who Danielle is and becomes throughout the story. And because he does such a good job of that, readers react to it. And when she screws up, they will call her out on it, even though she's a fictional character, just lines on a page. They'll still get annoyed that she treats another character the way she does at times, or enjoys the way she treats a character in some cases. So.
Right. So, if you want to read this webcomic, and we strongly recommend that you do, go to the Webtoons website. That's Webtoons, WEBTOONS.com. Sean and I have discussed webcomics in the past. So go there, do a search for Warning Label, or you can go to Thom Zahler's website, which is Thom Zahler, THOMZAHLER.squarespace.com, and that he provides a link over to Webtoons where you can read Warning Label. Sean, 3 really interesting webcomics that we looked at this month. We started off with Everblue by Michael Sexton. After that, we looked at Rado R's Handrava. And then we wrapped up with the recently completed Warning Label by Thom Zahler.
All good stuff.
All good stuff.
All
different.
All very different. Yeah.
Yes, in terms of not only the art style, but in terms of the storytelling style, the beats, the pacing, all of that.
Yeah. And you wanted to pick a theme this month.
Yeah. I thought since this is Will Eisner, well, I guess we're out of Will because we're recording this on the 8th, and Will Eisner week is the first week of March, so the 1st through the 7th. And we had thought about maybe picking 3 webcomics that had kind of a spirit-like feel to it, something the detective, noir, crime. But we were having kind of a difficult time finding comics like that we hadn't already discussed, and so we decided to give that up. And I'm glad we did because Warning Label, Handrava, and Everblue are really good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
So yeah, if you want to check out great comics, kind of like the 3 titles that we discussed this week, then definitely go to the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. If you like print versions of your comics, definitely check out dcbservice.com. Or if you prefer the webcomics or digital variety, in this case, then go to their sister site, mydigitalcomics.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this month's episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you've got some stuff you'd like to recommend we take a look at, either another webcomic or some other work by one of these creators we've talked about, you can email us. It might be a little easier to get a web address in there at 2guys, TWOGUIS, at comicsalternative.com. Or you can email me directly at Sean, SEAN, at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. But you can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on the blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
Plenty of ways to get in touch with us, plenty of ways to let us know what's going on.
That's right, and we do enjoy hearing from you, and we will be back next month with more webcomic goodness. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and we'll see you next month.